The courtroom had been quiet for most of the morning. Lawyers shuffled papers. Reporters tapped out notes. The judge adjusted his glasses. But when Song Yiren, already condemned to die, raised her voice and spoke the name that had haunted her for years, everything shifted. It was Qin Wenchen, she whispered, her tone quivering yet sharp enough to slice through the silence. He was behind it all. The room erupted into chaos. Some gasped, others shouted. Journalists nearly tripped over themselves to send out breaking headlines. The once untouchable man, the smiling face of China's entertainment empire, had just been exposed as the mastermind behind Yu Menglong's death. And in that single revelation, story everyone thought they knew collapsed into dust. To understand why this single name sent tremors through the court, one must go back to the glittering facade that hid years of shadows. Yu Menglong was not just an actor. He was a phenomenon. With his soft eyes, gentle smile, and calm demeanor, built a following that stretched across Asia. Fans adored him for his roles in youth dramas and admired him for his seemingly humble, grounded personality. He was the kind of star who made audiences believe in innocence, even when the industry around him was anything but innocent. But behind that radiant image, he carried wounds invisible to the public eye. The entertainment industry, outwardly sparkling, has always been a machine powered by contracts, demands, and sacrifices. For young stars like Yu Menglong, these contracts were often chains disguised as opportunities. They promised fame, wealth, and exposure. But between the fine lines lay obligations few dared to question. Nights at private clubs with wealthy investors. Appearances at parties where alcohol flowed endlessly. Obligations to laugh, smile, and please. These were not optional. They were part of the rules. And the man who set those rules, who decided which star would rise and which would fall, was Qin Wenchen. Wenchen was never the loudest man in the room. His power lay in his ability to sit quietly, smiling with a calm, almost fatherly expression. All his words sealed fates. He owned stakes in multiple entertainment companies, held editorial influence over media outlets, and had government officials in his pocket. In the industry, he was known as the Kingmaker. One nod from him could launch an unknown actor into stardom. One shake of his head could erase a career overnight. To the public, he was a philanthropist, sponsoring scholarships and arts programs. But to those trapped under his shadow, he was the overlord of a carefully managed empire of silence. For years, Yu Menglong played along. He signed contracts, attended events, smiled for the cameras. But as his popularity grew, so did his unease. Friends later recalled how he became quieter, withdrawn in private. Xing Fei, his ex-girlfriend, remembered nights when he would return from events pale and trembling. He looked at me once, she told investigators later, and said, every drink they pour is another nail in my coffin. Song Yiren, who often worked alongside him, also saw his decline. In the beginning, she thought it was simply exhaustion. But soon she realized it was something far darker. Yu was suffocating under the weight of demands he could no longer endure. The final straw came when Yu refused an invitation to a private gathering hosted by Qin's closest allies. It was meant to be a celebration of a new investment. But everyone in the industry knew such events were less about celebration and more about subjugation. Attendance was mandatory for those under Qin's watch. Yu declined, citing illness. Qin Wenchen, behind his gentle smile, was enraged. To him, this was not just disobedience, it was defiance. And defiance, in his world, was unforgivable. What followed was a sequence of events that now reads like a meticulously orchestrated play. Gao Taiyu, once Yu's colleague and friend, was pressured into persuading him to attend the next gathering. Zhang Yuxuan, another rising star eager to secure his place in Qin's empire, became the enforcer, ready to follow any order. Song Yiren, entangled in Qin's web, was instructed to be the bait. According to her later confession, Qin told Zhao Mengxiu, his trusted fixer, to make sure Yu remembers who holds his strings. That message filtered down to the pawns, leaving them trembling with fear but unable to resist. The night of Yu Menglong's death was shrouded in shadows. Fragments of truth have since emerged. He was invited to what was described as a casual dinner with colleagues. The location, a luxury suite controlled by Qin's network. Witnesses remembered Yu appearing uncomfortable, refusing to drink at first. But as glasses piled up and the atmosphere grew tense, the pressure mounted. Zhang Yuxun reportedly forced another glass into his hand. I looked away, unable to intervene. Song Yiren, by threats, played her part, urging you to just get through the night. What happened next remains a patchwork of testimonies. All agree on one thing: the evening turned violent. Shouts were heard. A scuffle broke out, and you collapsed. The time help arrived. It was too late. Officially, the story was packaged neatly: tragic accident due to overdrinking. Newspapers ran sanitized headlines. Drafted by editors loyal to Qin. Television hosts delivered sympathetic obituaries but avoided any mention of foul play. Fans mourned, believing their idol had simply been too fragile for the industry's relentless demands. But those who knew better were suffocated by fear. Behind closed doors, Qin Wenshin ensured silence. He called executives, arranged for payouts, and summoned editors. Witnesses who might have spoken were reminded of their contracts, their families, their futures. Song Yiren was one of the most heavily silenced. She had seen too much, played too close a role. Qin's fixer, Zhao Mingxiu, told her in a phone call that her career, and her life, would end if she spoke a word. She obeyed, trembling under the weight of complicity. Fear has its limits. And when her own trial came, death sentence was pronounced. Something inside her broke. In that final moment, with nothing left to lose, she named him Qin Wenshin. Who smiled for cameras. The philanthropist praised in magazines. The kingmaker whispered about in industry circles. Her voice cracked but did not waver as she described how he had ordered Yu's destruction. How he had orchestrated the gathering that led to his death. How every player in the tragedy had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Dismissed it as the desperate rambling of a doomed woman. Others felt their suspicions confirmed. But outside, the world was already shifting. The press seized on the story. Social media erupted. Fans who had long whispered of something darker behind Yu's death now had a name to direct their fury toward. Posters bearing Qin's face appeared online with captions like "The Smiling Killer" and "Kingmaker of Death." Protests broke out in front of Phoenix Star Entertainment, demanding answers. And for the first time, Qin Wenshin's smile faltered. The man who had pulled strings from the shadows for decades now found himself thrust into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The confession of one broken woman had torn open a curtain, revealing the monster behind it. The story was no longer about a fallen star. It was about the empire of silence that had devoured him, and the overlord who had believed he would never be exposed. Qin Wenshin stepped into the courtroom. The world seemed to hold its breath. For decades, he had been the silent power. The kingmaker who never raised his voice yet commanded entire empires. He wore his usual smile, and almost serene, as though the chaos surrounding him was little more than theater. Reporters jostled to capture his image. Headlines screamed across every platform, and the public demanded to hear what the overlord of showbiz would finally say. They had heard whispers for years, rumors of exploitation and control. But now the man himself would take the stand. The courtroom was packed. A storm of expectation and dread. First, Qin's testimony was measured. He spoke of his achievements, his role as a supporter of the arts, his belief in discipline and hard work. He painted himself as a benefactor, and who had given careers to countless young talents. As prosecutors pressed him, presenting evidence, messages, schedules, financial transfers, the mask began to slip. And then, with a chilling calmness that sent shivers down spines, Qin admitted what so many had feared: Yu Menglong's death had not been an accident. It had been orchestrated. He thought he could defy the system. Qin said, his voice even most detached. In this industry, obedience is survival. Disobedience is death. Yu Menglong chose this path. I only ensured the rules were enforced. Words fell into the silence of the courtroom like stones dropped into a well. Gasps echoed. Some wept openly. The judge froze, his gavel still in hand, as if unsure whether to strike or simply listen. He detailed the night of Yu's death with unnerving precision. He described instructing his fixer, Zhao Mingxiu, to remind Yu of his place. He admitted manipulating Gao Taiyu and Zhang Yuxun, dangling promises of lead roles to secure their compliance. He revealed that Song Yiren was coerced. Does bait because her closeness to Yu would make him lower his guard. Every move had been calculated. Every piece arranged on a board only he could see. described the confrontation as though he were recounting a business transaction, devoid of empathy, stripped of remorse. "Kill him with my hands," Qin continued, his eyes scanning the courtroom. "But my words carried the weight. And in this business, words are law." The spectators shuddered. Some reporters, hardened by years of covering scandals, admitted later that they felt sick listening to him. There was no guilt in his tone, only cold justification. It was a glimpse into the mind of a man who had played God for too long, saw human lives as pieces in his empire's game. Action was immediate. Yu Menglong's family sobbed uncontrollably. His mother, touching a framed photo of her son, collapsed in grief as the truth was spoken aloud. Fans in the gallery cried, shouted, and cursed a man who had stolen their idol. Even among industry insiders, once too afraid to speak, tears of anger rippled through the room. The confession was more than proof of guilt, it was a revelation of an entire culture of control, now exposed in its rawest, most terrifying form. Outside, the world exploded. Social media lit up with clips of Qin's testimony. Hashtags like Justice for You and Kingmaker exposed dominating every platform. Vigils formed in cities across China, fans holding candles and chanting Yu's name. Protesters demanded systemic change, calling for reforms to protect young stars from the claws of exploitation. International news outlets carried the story, labeling it the showbiz mafia trial. Qin Wenchen, once untouchable, had become the face of corruption and cruelty. Prosecutors seized on the momentum. They presented more evidence, hidden contracts that detailed impossible obligations, recordings of phone calls where Qin threatened managers who dared to question him, financial records tying him to shell companies that funneled hush money. Piece by piece, the empire he had built began to crumble under the weight of exposure. Though Qin never raised his voice, never broke his composure, the ability of his downfall was clear. The verdict was delivered under crushing anticipation. The judge, his voice steady but grave, declared Qin Wenchen guilty of orchestrating the murder of Yu Menglong. The sentence, death. The courtroom erupted, not in celebration, in a strange mix of grief, relief, and disbelief. Tao and Zhang Yuxun were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, their roles recognized as coerced but still complicit. Zhang Yiren's execution was upheld, though her testimony was acknowledged as the key that cracked open the case. History would judge her harshly. Also with a strange sympathy, a victim turned pawn who, in the end, chose truth over silence. For Yu Menglong, justice had finally been delivered. The court ruled his death not as an accident, a calculated act of murder. His name was cleared, his legacy restored. Fans flooded the streets in mourning and celebration, carrying posters of his face, singing his songs, and demanding that his story never be forgotten. In Beijing, a statue was erected in his honor, a symbol not only of his talent but of the price he paid for defiance. The impact rippled beyond one trial. Studios faced unprecedented scrutiny. Contracts were re-examined, clauses rewritten. Politicians vowed reforms, promising protections for young entertainers. For the first time, the silence seemed breakable. Even in the wake of Qin's execution, whispers persisted. If one kingmaker could fall, how many others still lurked in the shadows, waiting to rebuild the empire he had lost? In his final words before being led away, Wenchen looked back at the courtroom and spoke, his tone as calm as ever. This industry will always need kings. Remove one, and another will rise. His words lingered, chilling, a reminder that justice for Yu Menglong was both a triumph and a warning. As the candles burned outside and fans wept under the night sky, truth resonated above all others. Yu Menglong's death was no longer hidden in whispers and lies. It had been avenged in the open. Dignity restored by the very trial meant to silence him forever. The horrifying testimony of Qin Wenchen had not only sealed his own fate but had also carved Yu's story into history. The court had delivered justice, but the smile of the kingmaker, even in defeat, reminded the world that shadows never vanish, they only retreat, waiting for the next star to stumble into their reach. Lingering shadow. The legacy of Yu Menglong shone brighter, a beacon to those who would fight to ensure that silence would never again be bought with blood.